simply because Norway is at the top of what they call the Human Development Index. Many people have come across the Human Development Index. Yeah, it's rather than ranking countries according to their income, the UNDP proposed in 1990 that they develop an alternate rank, which they call the Human Development Index. So they wanted to get down a set of very, very basic factors which they thought, if there was an improvement in these areas, we'd be seeing development. And the things they were looking for was life expectancy. People can live longer, fuller lives. Knowledge, which they said you could pick up through literacy rates and schooling, and then income. So rather than just focusing on income, you're adding on these other elements as well. So life expectancy, literacy, schooling, and income. Some would say it's a better indicator rather than just looking at GDP per capita. Others criticise that it runs. There's a kind of large degree of similarity in terms of trends. But I just think it's often interesting to just compare the two. So Norway, traditionally you have the Canadians and the Scandinavians feature in the top 5, and they have for a very long period of time. And this is through a combination of very good social policies. Their kids all go to school, their adults go to school, high income rates, low levels of inequality, very good social medicine, so life expectancy tends to be very high. Case here, Norway and Niger. The very fact of being born in one country has a huge impact and implications for how you live your life. In terms of the possibility of you dying before your 5th birthday, the possibility of you accessing school and getting basic literacy skills, the possibility of you being able to find a medical centre, a hospital or a clinic when you get sick. And it's brought out quite starkly when you look at the comparison here. 81 years is the life expectancy for your average Norwegian versus 52 in Niger. You've got a literacy rate of nearly 100% in Norway versus a literacy of under a third. So 2 out of every 3 are not functionally literate in Niger, which is a very, very high figure in 2010. When we talk about kind of the global economy requiring knowledge-based economies in order to create sustainable growth. The number of school years kind of reflect that, an average of 1.4 years in Niger versus 12.6 years in Norway. And of course all of that compounded by the fact that the GDP per capita, the income per head, if it was equally divided in Norway, is just under $60,000. Whereas adjusting for prices, it's only about just under $700 in Niger. And these are all kind of self-fulfilling. Low income, low taxes, low levels of government expenditure, etc., etc., etc. To look at it in a slightly different way, this is kind of drawing on WHO figures, World Health Organization. Again, you've got GDP per capita. Government spend in Norway per person on healthcare is under $5,000. So if you're going to get sick, get on a plane and fly to Oslo, because you get really good healthcare. Yeah? Versus $35 in Niger. Now, $35 just doesn't buy you a lot of healthcare anywhere in the world, even in Niger. Maternal mortality rate, so the proportion of women that die as a result of childbirth per 100,000 is 7 in Norway versus 1,800 in Niger. So pregnancy is actually a death sentence for many women in countries in the south. Under 5 mortality rate, 4 in Norway per 1,000 versus 176 in Niger. And the number of doctors, 39 per 10,000 and less than 1 in Niger. Now, not to paint Niger in a very bad sense. There's huge disparities, and it tends to be a benchmark in terms of maternal mortality rates and under 5 mortality rates. One positive thing out of this is if you actually look at how these issues have trended over the last 10 years, you see massive progress being made even in countries like Niger. Very positive steps to roll out antenatal care, reduce providing access for clinics for women, skilled birth attendants, to roll out vaccination programs, to roll out primary schools. And all of these things are reversing some of these very negative figures that you have here. But that's not to say there's an awful lot to be done. Yeah. And aid is one of the factors which some people believe can help redress these imbalances and speed up these sort of processes. In particular, who hasn't heard of the Millennium Development Goals? It's a very loaded question. If you haven't, keep your hand down. Yeah. Millennium Development Goals, the world's biggest promise. These goals, these 8 goals that were set in 2000 in order to try and halve world poverty, get all the kids that should be in school, make sure girls go to school the same numbers of boys, reduce maternal mortality rates, reduce under 5 mortality rates, improve access to water, sanitation, better access to markets in terms of trade, etc., etc. These Millennium Development Goals, these 8 goals with an end date in 2015, gave the world a whole new impetus, particularly the development sector, in order to aim for these very ambitious and quite controversial targets for many people. And what was going to drive them? Aid. Yeah. It was clearly costed by Jeffrey Sachs, who was the point man for Kofi Annan, and he estimated that on average countries would need the spend would have to be about $110 per person per year up until 2015, and that in order to reach that, donor countries would have to significantly ramp up their aid budgets in order to assist countries in the South match that sort of funding to meet the Millennium Development Goals. But aid driven. Now at the same time, some of the criticisms, who thought of the Millennium Development Goals? Were these goals that came from the grassroots in Kenya, in Ecuador, in Kyrgyzstan? Were these goals that came from the departments of health in Tajikistan or in China? Or were these goals that came from the OECD, from the DFIDs, the GGZs, the UNs of this world? And they tended, again, the feature of the Millennium Development Goals is they represent to a large extent the very top-down type of aid practice that tends to exist within the aid industry or the aid sector. Everybody okay? Yeah? I robbed this from Owen Barder, and I actually really like it as a quote. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I think it's quite interesting. Some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. And this kind of sets the scene for why doesn't aid work? Yeah, we don't really know because it's very difficult. When you think of aid, these are just you've got the ubiquitous 4-wheel drive. I don't know if anybody read Paul Theroux's book Dark Star in Africa. Anybody have a look at that? No? An American author on his 60th birthday treated himself to a trip by train from Cairo down to Cape Town, and he developed a hatred of NGO personnel that he used to meet at border posts who drove these big white shiny 4-wheel drive vehicles, but none of whom would let him sit in the vehicle and cross from one border post to another. He used to call them these angels of virtue, quite bitterly. Now you've got a range here. This is Irish Aid, bilateral donor, multilateral, International Red Cross, some of the big players, the Oxfams, the Greenpeaces, Amnesty International. And this is actually a refugee camp, the Malay refugee camp on the Thai border. We've got Burmese refugees just situated on the border there. And lots of money going in order to keep those camps going. So the objectives, we've kind of covered some of this. Self-interest and political power, solidarity, aid to improve the lives of the poorest, and transformational. Ultimately that aid is there to boost social and physical infrastructure and bring this sort of change that countries in the West have experienced over a much shortened time horizon. but not forgetting the element that you talked about, promoting institutional robustness in order to improve self-sufficiency. At the end of the day, the aid industry should be there to see itself out of a job. If it does it right, it should disappear. That's what should happen in an ideal world. Some definitions. You've noticed I've talked about aid. I've flitted between foreign aid, development assistance, and ODA. ODA is the term that they use. The Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is this club, some people call it the Rich Industrialised Country Club. Yeah? They have a subcommittee which looks at issues of transfers of funds from the north to the south, particularly aid flows. And they actually define aid very, very tightly. And for them, ODA is what we talk about when we talk about aid. There are other flows, official aid, and this tends to be money going to what they call Part 2 countries, which were the former communist countries. Part 1 countries are the traditional recipient countries. And then you've got other official flows. So, for instance, trade credits, for instance, would fall under this. It would be a non-concessional aid. One interesting thing for some people is that not all aid is grant money. Some aid comes in the form of loans that have to be repaid, but they carry a very, very low interest rate, and that's why we call them aid. If there's the equivalent of what they call a 25% grant element, if the interest rate is so low that you end up paying back 25% less than if you borrowed in the market, you can categorize that as aid. Okay? So not all aid is grants. A lot of it comes as loan. Now, it must have the promotion of economic development and welfare at its heart. So you don't get military expenditure. You cannot book military spend under ODA. I was talking to Stephen in the office, though, and there is a big push amongst some significant donors to loosen up this definition in order to allow certain military/peace expenditures to be included as aid spend to book it. Particularly the Americans and the British have been kind of pushing to make the definition a little bit more flexible, which is a little bit alarming. In terms of its sources, the main source is the bilateral, which is government to government, and then you have the multilateral, which is government to the likes of the UN and to the World Bank, and they in turn then disperse the funds down to a recipient country. So you've got a mix of sources. We still have the majority of funds going from country to country, and that's for some of the reasons that you talked about. Self-interest, economic, political, it could be cultural affinity, it could be historical. If we look at where does UK DFID money go, it tends to go to former colonies. Where does American money go to? It goes to a mix of former colonies down south, well, not former colonies, I shouldn't say, neo-colonial states, but countries that it's quite interested in terms of kind of acting as a bulwark against communism in the old days, but as kind of a geopolitical, strategic issue. So, for instance, Egypt was one of the largest recipients of American aid flows before Iraq and Afghanistan came along. So the two principal countries now for the Americans would be the Afghanistan and Iraq. And that is interesting, because if we look at aid and we assess it in terms of its ability to address the needs of the poorest, but we actually look at where aid actually goes, we see that the two don't coincide. That often aid money goes to countries that you could describe as middle income rather than countries that are actually the poorest. Paul Collier, who was a former chief economist of the World Bank based in Oxford, he often mentioned that in a paper that,